Welcome back to part two. We're back with our conversation with the principal at Charles River Associates, Muad Al-Masri.
In terms of data, right, and information that is requested to have all the kind of reports that you want to have, and I'm sure having the information requested, having them in the UK and in Europe is completely different from requesting this information in the Middle East. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in terms of data collection?
Yes, I would have to say it depends on the industry and also on the region, as you said. So there are, for example, very kind of niche and specific industries where there might be market reports that report on this particular industry, this particular segment of the industry, and that gives you the market size and maybe a breakdown by region. So then your job is very easy. You just have to collect that and maybe kind of discuss with the business whether that reflects reality or not, their views on third-party reports. In other industries, you don't really find that. So you have to be a lot more creative in trying to come up with very credible market shares that are based on sound assumptions. And it's the same thing regionally. So maybe in one region, you have very good data because there might be a third-party report available in that region, let's say in the UK or Europe, but you don't have it in the Middle East. And again, you have to get very creative. But it's not, it's not an impossible task. You can do it by, discussing with the business, by making certain assumptions. For example, if you're trying to evaluate, let's say, the market for rice, you can, and you have no data at all. I think you would have data in this case because supermarkets can.
Absolutely.
That's a lot more available. But hypothetically, if you didn't have any data, you could, start from a very, let's say, top-down methodology and say, okay, there are X million people living in this country. Let's say they consume, X grams of rice per year, based on maybe some research that you've done. That means that there are X tons of rice being sold. The average price of a kilogram of rice is this much. That means the total market size is Y. Our sales are, 10% of that. That means we have a 10% share. So you can get very creative and come up with either bottom-up or top-down estimates to estimate the market, even if you have very little data, just based on some desk research of certain data points that you then combine to come up with an estimate. So then you have to show your methodology to the authority. That's why it has to be very credible.
So when you do show your methodology to the authority and you're assessing market share, and some of our countries in the Middle East still use the market share threshold to determine whether merger control is mandatory. So how, from an economist point of view, is that a fair assessment of market dominance?
So I would say the best practice in my view is to take market shares only as a starting point, because it's a very static measure that may be indicative of market power but should not be conclusive on whether a firm has market power. So I could give two examples in which the same market share might mean very different things. So in one case, you could have a market share of 40%, but 2 years ago it was 20%, 1 year ago it was 30%. And then you look at the bidding data of the firm or the win-loss data, and you found that they have actually won 9 out of their 10 bids, their past 10 bids. So you can very much tell that this firm is on the rise, its market share is increasing, it keeps winning against its competitors. And so a market share of 40% could very much mean that there is a real concern about a dominant position. Now compare that with a scenario where you have, again, 40% market share, but 2 years ago it was 80%. And you look at the bidding and the win-loss data and you find that they're actually losing 9 out of 10 bids. That means that maybe there has been a new entry or a new innovative competitor that is aggressively taking away market share from them. And in that case, you have a lot less to worry about because this market share does not seem to indicate that there is real market power. It's kind of eroding. So dominance have a kind of an important part of dominance is that you have a persistent market share, and you're not facing the threat of new entry. So a dominant firm would be resting on its laurels and not be afraid of competition. There's incentive to innovate.
So, tell me about disruptors. In the tech sector, you have a company that has 0 market share, and then boom, in 2 years it has 50% market share. How do you look at disruptors from an economist point of view? And do authorities really understand the concept of disruptors?
It's a very fascinating topic, and it's very important in the tech market, as you said, because there could be a new, let's say, technology or new tech firm that is actually maybe the only one of its kind. So if you define a market very narrowly, you could find that it's a monopoly. It's the only competitor active in this field. But you really have to look at, in this case, the barriers to entry and the dynamics of competition in this space. So what you ask in this case is not whether it currently faces competition, because in that case you would ban all mergers that are in the tech space that involve any kind of new innovative industry. But that's not really the right thing to do, because this firm could very much face the threat of new entry from adjacent segments, not really from its own segment. There could be a lot of, you have to look at, for example, venture capital funding in this space. Maybe there's a lot of appetite to fund new startups that compete in this space. So then you also have to be more creative with your arguments. You can't use like a simple market share methodology to conclude that this is the only firm of its kind and has a 100% market share.
So what's interesting is usually when we have clients come to us and they ask us, we ask the questions a little bit, a very small RFI, what's your relevant market, what's your market share, and all of that. And we feel that maybe the analysis is a little bit more shallow, let's say, and it doesn't, obviously it's not as sophisticated as what an economist would do, but I do think that it is important that we start having criteria, a little bit more of a more expanded RFI when we start to asking what is your market share. It's not just a number that you're giving us more, there are other factors to consider, whether from an industry perspective, if you're in the tech sector, from other perspective, in terms of what we can calculate to see the market share it is. So it seems that there needs to be a more in-depth approach.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I even think to the extent that Muaz was mentioning that market share threshold is really a starting point. Which you can use the numbers for analysis to conclude whether there is dominance or not. But even on that point, even if our laws shift to adopt the annual turnover threshold, which is selling at an X figure or more as a trigger for merger control, even that doesn't sound proper to me as a fair assessment of market dominance. Is that your view as well?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's only a starting point to say, does this merger affect this country in some way? So it's more a jurisdictional question. Do you have jurisdiction to review this merger? But it tells you very little about the competitive impact of this merger by just knowing the turnover or kind of a rough estimate of market share. What this mean?
And so that's why, proficiency in economics is something now that we as competition lawyers need to be really now well aware of. There's another more readings that we need to be doing on that space, and that's why we have you here actually. And we're so lucky that after this filming, you're actually going to give a training to our regional practice on Economist. Can you just tell us a little bit of a few things that you'll be telling us today in the training?
Yeah, of course. I would say that as a starting point, let's say take the example of a horizontal merger. It's a lot of the things that we talked about. It's looking at not just the static view of what is the situation now, but looking at more dynamic view of how are competitive dynamics changing, what does the firm view as its competitors. There's also the concept of closeness of competition. So there might be 5 firms in the market, but firms compete with some competitors more closely than others. A second aspect is, especially with the rise of tech firms and platforms, it's very important to look at the business model of the firm, and because that tells you a lot about its incentives. So, for example, a marketplace business model where you run a marketplace and you sell your own products, but then you also allow third-party products on the platform. And then you take a commission of the sales of the third-party products. That gives rise to very different incentives to foreclose these third-party sellers. And it's not really obvious that you would actually do something to foreclose them, because you can monetize on their sales. So when they grow on your platform, you take a higher and higher commission in absolute terms. And so it's not really clear that you have an incentive to kind of kick them off the platform or disadvantage them. So knowing the business model of the firm tells you a lot about its incentives and how it competes with rivals, and whether it has an incentive to foreclose rivals, for example. A third thing that is very much on the rise, for example, in the UK and Europe, and being heavily discussed, are non-horizontal mergers, so vertical and conglomerate mergers. There was the view that these are less concerning because they do not involve direct elimination of a direct competitor. Now there's increasingly a skeptical view of that. And again, it's related to the rise of tech platforms, because they often buy rivals that are not really in their space but in adjacent segments in order to kind of enter each other's segments. And so there has been a lot of concern that a lot of kind of potentially problematic conglomerate mergers and vertical mergers have gone under the radar. And there's also a lot of new economic thinking that shows that actually these mergers could be more problematic than we previously thought.
Yeah, and one more thing you mentioned that was really interesting is VCs. So in addition to looking at the full picture and totality of circumstances, we actually, when you look at VCs, their appetite for funding techs is really high, because they're afraid that they're missing out on the next unicorn. And so that's why you'll find a lot of tech companies in this space necessarily. So there is also the element of VCs as well.
Yeah, I mean, there can be a long list of factors to look at, but how relevant is this to our region? You've done some economic reports related to our region. What is your view of what the authorities require, or how deep of analysis should there be?
Yeah, so we've definitely, I can remember distinctly one previous case where we relied a lot on evidence showing that venture capital has a lot of appetite in this industry, in this space, and in this region specifically, because this case involved, again, two tech platforms that were merging together, and they were kind of new and, fairly new concept, kind of replacing a traditional industry, and they were the only two of their kind. So looking at this merger in a static sense would have led to a conclusion that this is, a merger to monopoly. So it was very important to show that there's a lot of venture capital appetite to invest in this industry, to encourage new entry, and that this is the reason why this merger may not be as problematic as it seems on the outside. And what's nice about that is that a few years later, the merger got cleared. A few years later, I could actually see, for example, in my home country, in Jordan, new startup coming in and taking a lot of market share. So our predictions were actually borne out in the end. And we could see that because there was a lot of appetite to invest in this space, that meant that if you saw funding as a barrier to entry, that this barrier to entry was not actually one to be concerned about.
Well, I've certainly learned a lot today.
Yeah, we still have our training, so
And I feel that we're very short-sighted looking at it from only a legal perspective, and there's much more depth when you look at what an economist's view is.
There's more sophistication in the way they look at things.
Absolutely. So, thank you very much for coming in today. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Really, you came all the way from London. We're really excited. We're excited for the training that we're going to have with our regional offices. Everyone's really excited, and we hope we have you again. And thank you, everyone. So this we just ended our episode with Muad, which was really interesting, and I'm sure we'll have future episodes as well. Thank you for tuning in.